Good morning everyone and welcome to the second meeting of the Local Government Communities Committee in 2017. Can I remind everyone present to turn off mobile phones, and as members' papers are provided in a digital format, you may see us using tablets, devices during the course of the meeting to look at our papers. We've received no apologies this morning and we'll move to agenda item 1, which is decision on taking business in private. The committee is invited to agree to take agenda items 4 and 7, consideration of a draft report on payments to returning officers and draft letters in relation to its EU scrutiny in private. Are we all agreed? Okay, thank you. Move to agenda item 2, Scottish local government elections and voting. At agenda item 2, the committee will hold 2 evidence sessions on Scottish local government elections and voting, one from stakeholders with a role in the electoral process, followed by a session with the Minister for Parliamentary Business. These sessions follow one from our evidence session on the 2nd of November 2016, when we heard from academia, the Electoral Reform Society Scotland, the Modern Studies Association, Unison Scotland, Shelter Scotland, MECOP and Enable Scotland. So this morning, can I welcome Andy O'Neill, Head of the Electoral Commission Scotland, Alan Armstrong, Strategic Director, Education Scotland, Mary Pitt-Caithley, Convener, and Chris Highcock, Secretary, Electoral Management Board for Scotland, Ian Milton, Grampian Electoral Registration Officer, and Chair, Electoral Registration Committee, Scottish Assessors Association. Thank you everyone for coming along this morning. No one has indicated that they wish to make an opening statement, but there's an offer there. Any brief comments before we move to questions? Okay, well, let's move to questions, but maybe just start by saying that the committee is really keen to work in partnership with maximising voter turnout in this May's elections. It's been a perennial problem in how we incentivise, encourage and motivate individuals to register and to vote, particularly at council elections. We will do what we can as a committee to assist in that process, and hopefully this scrutiny session will be part of that. Can we go to the first question from Alexander Stewart, MSP?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Many individuals see voting as a must-do, but they seem to be of an older generation where they're highly motivated to get out. And during the referendum, there was a high motivation from across the piece as well. But when it comes to sort of local government elections, we find ourselves slipping back normally. My question is, it's the perennial one about younger voters. It's how you tackle that. And is there an awareness that is provided at college, at university, at workplaces to try and encourage younger people to become much more actively involved in the voting process?
Okay, who'd like to take that? Don't all fight each other at once. Andy O'Neill.
I'll go in. Just jump in.
Right,
okay.
I think. Sorry, I think I've got the main point of your question. Yeah, I think you're probably right. I think the older you are, the more likely you're going to vote, and therefore the reverse of that is the younger you are, the less likely you're going to vote. Obviously, it's very important to engage people in the democratic process. We spend a lot of time doing so. How you tackle voters in terms of our job under PEPERA, the Act which sets up the Commission, and also the Local Electoral Administration Scotland Act 2011, we have a duty to make people aware of forms of government, current forms of government, and also electoral systems, and that's what we do. It's down to you guys as politicians to incentivise them to go and vote for you. I think, in general, it's a truism to say that if people think it's important, they'll vote, and that's why you get 84% in the independence referendum in 2014, and the last local government election was 39.8%, and obviously people are seeing that as not as important, even though, of course, it is. We make sure that people have information easily accessible and understand how to register to vote, and also how to fill in ballot papers. And that in itself helps, I think, people to turn out. I think particularly with young people, and of course, in the coming election, 16 and 17-year-olds will vote for the first time. We've worked with educationalists and other colleagues who will presumably talk about this. We've provided resources. We're not educationalists. We have no role in formal education, but we've obviously got a lot of expertise around elections. So we worked in partnership with colleagues to my left, to develop a campaign, a toolkit, ready to vote, which we used in the Scottish Parliament election. We finished up with about 78% of all high schools throughout Scotland running registration drives within the school. We've revised and improved the campaign for this year. It's going to talk about registration. It also talks about how to vote, but it also talks about what councils do. There are little exercises people can use in classes and various things. And it's not just for formal education, it's for other places. Miriam?
Yeah, in terms of your question was around colleges and universities, I think you'd extend that to schools as well, and other settings. If we start on that kind of move through education, the Curriculum for Excellence sets out for two broad areas: the broad general education from age 3 to 15, and then the senior phase with qualifications mainly. And there are two distinct elements in this that promote political literacy, that help the context for the kind of activities that Andy outlined, the learning materials that can be shared. So for children right the way from 3 to 18, the Scottish pupil that we wish right the way through education, we expect them to develop 4 major capacities to be successful learners, confident individuals, but also effective contributors and responsible citizens. Now, within that, there's an entitlement for all young people to be learning about the skills of political literacy, how to debate, how to understand, have empathy with others, listen to decisions around about them, take part in decisions, have their own personal voice in these. And that then gives opportunity for teachers to run mock elections, to elect for prefects, or young people in primary schools to take responsibilities in the playground or at lunchtime, etc. So that should be embedded and is embedded right the way from 3 to 18. Then distinctly you have a curriculum area around about social studies. And the social studies area is set for all children between the age of 3 to 15. And within social studies, you have very particular outcomes for children there. And that helps them, again, in terms of understanding their society, understanding the place and the environment and how decisions are made, economy and business in the local community and across the world. So children then learn progressively through that. In the qualifications phase, the naturally, history, geography, modern studies, all this is embedded within there. For young people who are not studying these particular subjects, then that generic involvement of young people in developing their capacities is still available in schools. And that then allows senior pupils often to help younger pupils, both in primary and in secondary schools. Colleges, you have your student council, who very often I know from first-hand evidence that I've seen, who promote that either mock elections, well, obviously for their own thing, but also when elections, big elections, national elections come along, they do that as well. I expect, although I don't know, that universities do something similar.
Yes, and I think that perhaps we did step up our game a bit at the time of the referendum, planning for the referendum, because that was the first time that 16 and 17-year-olds had the vote. So we, I think, recognised as local authorities that we had a captive audience, if you like, that we could reach our 15, 16 and 17-year-olds fairly easily. And so we were quite happy at that stage to take on the responsibility of trying to encourage them to register and then to vote. And I think that whole issue of they have to understand the importance of registration before they can think about who or you know, what they might vote. So I think it's probably fair to say that a few years ago, mainly pupils would find out about democracy and voting systems through modern studies. That's significantly different these days, and I think it would be seen as a whole school effort. It would be something that would be covered for all pupils, not just those who choose to take that as a subject choice. And it starts very early. It starts in primary schools and it goes right through, as my colleague has said, in the secondary sector as well. There are particular events that help to focus everybody's attention on that. So there's a registration day on the 1st of March, And one of the things that I've been asking my colleagues as chief executives, rather than as returning officers, but as chief executives, is to go back to their council and contact all of their secondary heads directly to encourage them to take part in that day on the 1st of March, to encourage registration. When pupils aren't entirely focused on issues around exams, for example, it's a fairly helpful time to be doing something like that. Get the pupils registered. That's the most important first step towards encouraging them to actually go out and vote.
I think in the written evidence that the EMB has submitted to the committee as well, we give a sample of various activities that are undertaken across Scotland, particularly around young people. I'd also say it's not a uniform group of people, and just think of young people. There are particular initiatives, for example, in Mary's council, looked after children, particular hard to reach sectors of the community which need to be focused on particularly. So definitely point to some of the examples we've got there in the evidence around mock elections, around direct work with schools, around looked after children, other people that the social work services are in touch with. And Ian will probably talk about the way in which the schools lists are taken by the EROs and they write out directly.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Mary used the term captive audience, and the reduction in the franchise age gave electoral registration officers a superb opportunity. Because it meant that we could actually start to engage with young citizens age 14 upwards before they moved into that slightly more mobile and dynamic stage in their life when they maybe leave their secondary education and move on into employment or other education, or else take a year out or something like that. So actually capturing the captive audience while they're still in a relatively stable sort of residence situation and attending education through secondary schools was an ideal opportunity, and that's one that we've not been slow to pick up on. So, for example, registration officers will take lists from all the schools and also from colleges and universities as well of students there, and we work through those. To actually register to vote now, members will be aware that we've got an individual electoral registration programme now that means that there's identity verification. Now, for under 16s, the identification relies on date of birth and national insurance number. For under 16s, there are no national insurance numbers. So, but the 2015 Reduction of Voting Age Act for Scottish elections allowed registration officers to use education records. So that gave us a great opportunity to get that information in and use it. So we take the school lists, we check that against anybody who has already registered, make sure that we're not approaching people who've already registered. But if they haven't registered, we will then write to them individually and invite them to register. Now, not all of those students will want to register, but certainly they get the opportunity to do so. And they get that opportunity when they're 15 years old or thereabouts. And to tie in with that, picking up on Mary's point about writing to the chief executives, and that letter just went out at the end of the year as a heads up for the work that we're going to be doing in March. Registration officers are also approaching their education services and their schools to offer training for the principal teachers involved, so that they can make sure the teachers have the materials, and then the teachers who are experts at teaching can use that material and make sure that the message is out there.
I'm very encouraged by the response that I've received, because it does show that you're focusing in and you're trying to broaden the horizons and capture that market, which we all know we need to try and engage. And as you've said already, if they are interested and if they are active, they will become much more participative, and that's what we want them to do. So thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you. Some supplementaries on that, Ruth Maguire?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. I welcome all the evidence that you provided on the different things that are going on, and I recognise some of the work that was done in my own area in North Ayrshire by schools and youth workers, and indeed the college. I just wonder if we can learn any lessons from that real proactive work and the different sort of initiatives with other communities or groups of voters that are maybe not particularly franchised. I know that we've heard that folk in the private rented sector, homeless people, certain ethnic communities are quite hard to reach. Can we learn any lessons from the things we're doing well with young people?
things that we've reflected on is trying to speak to people at an appropriate time for them. So as I mentioned before, avoiding exam time. Well, you can't shift the date of elections. An election in May is around the time of exams normally, either for senior pupils or for university or college students. But they have to get the important bits like registration out of the way first before they get busy on that, because it's about relative priorities, I think. So it would be exactly the same for those other hard-to-reach groups. They have to make a decision for themselves that it is a priority for them, with all the other issues that they may be struggling with in terms of housing or jobs or surviving financially. They have to make a decision that it's important that they register, and then that they make time on the day to go and vote, or that they make time to get a postal vote and they have somewhere where that can go. So I think just recognising that because it's a priority for us, because we're steeped in it, and you're exactly the same, it's not necessarily got a similar priority for some other groups. So trying to speak to them about why it's important and about how easy it can be, because sometimes people have misunderstandings about how difficult it is to vote, and they think they require ID cards or whatever, you know, so that there can be issues that make them disinclined to even engage in a discussion about it. So it's for me, it's about relative priorities. They have to think that for them that's an important thing for them to engage with.
I think one of the lessons as well is picking appropriate channels of communication, and they won't always be the same for all these different distinct communities. We work close with schools directly through teachers and through the curriculum and elsewhere that way, but there's also ways of going through social media which can be appropriate to a much broader level. One of the areas is often underrepresented is home movers or private rented sector. And I know in some areas they'll work directly on websites that that show rented accommodation. So there'll be an advert prior to registration to say, this is the key registration dates. When people are looking for houses there, that's a message that comes up. Some EROs will also write to home movers. So when they register a new address, they'll get the list of people that have moved and write directly to them.
Yes, if I may just pick up on that point. I mean, timing is a key issue now. You know, we've moved from an era when electoral registers were drawn up once a year, and that was that, to a very dynamic situation. I mean, registers do change dramatically throughout the year. It's online registration, and people now we live a very much a sort of last-minute sort of or just-in-time sort of existence. I think quite a few of us might, and certainly the electorate is no different. And so it's only for some hard-to-reach groups, it's only at that point when the election is called that they start to think about wanting to vote and registering to vote. At the same time, we're doing some work. For example, just now we're working with tenancy deposit scheme operators because they obviously give us a good hand into the private rented market. So we're doing some research with them just now into whether we can use their information to actually identify potential electors. Because my view is, as a registration officer, that the more that more data that we can use to identify people who aren't registered but could be, then and approach them direct, the more likely we're going to have success, rather than sort of the broad brush annual canvas approach. So we're doing some work with tenancy deposit scheme operators just now, some research on how useful that data is to identify potential electors. But we're also looking at using their media with their contact with the tenant or new tenant, because their contact will be when a tenant has just moved in, to highlight the fact that this is how you can get registered to vote. So there's a two-pronged approach there. And that is the line that I see registration developing.
Andy, you wanted to add some of that?
I mean, I think you're right. I think the lesson from the education campaign is learning to work with partners and working in an appropriate way. And we spend a lot of time dealing with partners because, whilst we can do the kind of high-level TV, radio ads, leaflets through your doors, the connections through various community groups is very successful for us, and we've found that over the years. And we spend a number of hours in the autumn of every year engaging with potential partners who we can work with in the lead up to the election, and we go out and talk to them and find out what they want and find out how they want it, because giving them dusty, dry information about electoral registration or how to fill in the ballot paper or whatever is fine for someone like me, but obviously it depends what your clients are or your customers. So we try and source it and write it in the right way. We will, in the next week, produce a resources pack for these customers, or our partners rather, which will have kind of appropriate information, and it'll have posters and pop-up banners for websites, and it'll have suggested social media informatics and tweets, and we'll do PR with them. And we work with partners across all the sectors. So we work with young people, care organisations, BME, care, disability, renters and movers, and all the things you can probably think of. And particularly things like for homeless people, we've worked with Shelter in the past and provided information and worked with them in a PR sense. And also we work with the Scottish Association of Landlords to get into the private rented sector, because the private rented sector is an area where we know lots of people aren't registered and don't take part in democracy.
Alan Armstrong, do you want to add?
At a national level as well, I think we recognise the strength of community learning development practitioners in engaging daily with people who are often on the margins of society. So we've worked with Edinburgh University and Learning Link, which is the umbrella organisation for all volunteer organisations working with adults and vulnerable adults in Scotland. We worked with them to develop some support materials for the practitioners in their work in engaging directly with vulnerable adults. And we've helped to develop materials for their national website for their hub. So alongside the adult learning, we've also worked with Young Scot and with YouthLink from the youth sector to, again, mirror that kind of reach to as many young people as we can.
Ruth? Yeah.
Just thanks for those answers. Just briefly, convener. Mr. O'Neill, the materials and the sort of packs you're talking about producing, are these provided in different languages and in accessible formats? And yes, good. Okay.
Just mop up one or two things there. Ian Milton was very interested to hear that you're talking about working with landlords. That one of the key things that every registered landlord has to do is provide a tenant information pack by law, or they can't be a registered landlord. Is the relevant voter registration form required to be in that tenant information pack?
Well, we could put a voter registration form into that information pack, but we'd be more inclined to give the web address gov.uk register to vote, because that's the way that many people will now interact, as much the majority of people will interact. But we can also provide contact details as well. That's what we're looking at with the tenancy deposit scheme operators, of making sure that these sort of signposts are there. And the question then, of course, is the new tenant who's just moved into their house and very keen to get their utilities sorted out and their broadband and all that, are they going to see registration to vote as another important task to do, or is the timing issue going to kick in and they will only turn to that when an electoral event is approaching?
Take all that as a given. You make some very good points, Mr. Milton. I suppose I'm making the point that if there's a tenant information pack which will tell you where your deposit's held, will tell you electrical safety, it will tell you gas safety, it will give you an inventory of all the cups, saucers, if it's furnished accommodation, whatever in the house, that one piece of paper in there that signposts people to whether it's social media or a council website, that could be in the tenant information pack. Now, how prescriptive, I did this in a previous committee, I think, how prescriptive is that? What I mean is it in the gift of local authorities to decide what obligations are on landlords to put in those packs, or does it have to be prescribed in guidance from this place?
I couldn't say what the rules are for local authorities dictating what goes into a tenancy information pack, but from a registration officer viewpoint, there's no prescription as such. It's a case of that we will work with as many partner bodies as we can to get that message across, that that's the website to go to, gov.uk, register to vote, and or else your local ERO if you don't have online capability.
That's helpful. That's maybe one to also follow up. Also, Andy, you mentioned back to Ruth Maguire about the potential partners you work with and the resources that are produced. The initial question from Alexander Stewart was in relation to schools and young people. and the written evidence did seem to be top heavy in relation to schools, and I get that and understand that, and those are key partners for young people. But if I was to look at the young people in my constituency that are perhaps least likely to vote, or whose parents might be least likely to vote, they're also probably the least likely to engage at a school level with all of that stuff as well. But they are more likely to engage with the local dance class instructor and the local judo instructor and the local football coach, and you could go through that list. So how coordinated an initiative is there across the places where young people actually want to hang out? And I say this as a former teacher, and actually perhaps give a credence and a validity to an adult peer who are saying to them it's really important to register to vote. So what work goes on in a structured fashion with the amazing youth groups that exist right across the country? Just wondering if anyone could pick up at Mary Pitt-Caithley.
I think a lot of that would be led by colleagues in community learning and development across councils, and I think they take that responsibility very seriously from what I can see, and are coordinated in their own efforts in youth clubs, etc., to try and ensure that people have an understanding of what is required to be an active citizen. So that would very much be led there. But I have to say there are things that, you know, for example, in the youth club, there may not be much in the way of time to sit and actually get make your registration. You might not know your national insurance number offhand, whatever. So one of the things that we do in many schools is actually have a desk with somebody from the ERO, usually just outside the dinner hall, which is where you capture most pupils, and that would be where they would be on a certain day or in a certain week able to actually register. Because it's one thing to engage them in some out of school sports club or whatever, but actually turning that into a positive decision to register and then further down the line to vote is something that requires a wee bit, you know, they actually have to take some positive steps to do something. They have to get their NI number, they have to complete the forms. So, you know, it's a combination of efforts. I think it's about raising awareness in some places and then actually about turning that into positive action to register and then to vote.
So is there a structured, Andy, I'll take it in a second, is there, I mean, I agree, maybe I agree, schools is the most obvious place to do it. You've got skilled staff, you've got your client groups there, you know, lots of opportunities to work with them, lots of experience and get all that. It's about getting sometimes the parts that are hardest to reach, even after they're registered to vote, and using our youth sector out there to do some of that work. Is there a structured approach to that, or is it an informal approach? Andy O'Neill, I don't know if you could help.
I mean, to add to what Mary said, I mean, how we tackle it, obviously we work with the councils as councils and provide information and such. And I mentioned earlier our partnership attempts to engage with people. And over the years we've worked with Boys Brigade, we've worked with the Scout movement and such like. But we also work with Young Scot and YouthLink Scotland and Scottish Youth Parliament. And we do a lot of social media. We provide information so they can use in social media campaigns. So in that sense, we engage with people who may be disengaged through social media.
I mean, there's clearly tremendous work ongoing. This is not a criticism of the existing work. This is trying to give added value so that more people register and more people vote. I'll maybe continue with a line of questioning and let my colleagues in, because I'm trying to get to a point where if you look at voter turnout, so moving away slightly from young people, voter turnout, if you look at the 2012 elections, I looked at just for Glasgow, and I could see in parts of my constituency about 27% were voting in the council elections, but if you were in Gerskaden or Scotstoun, it was 39%. Still quite a poor turnout, but significantly higher than the area I represent. If you look at the Scottish referendum on independence, eye-watering turnout levels, but in East Renfrewshire and East Dunbartonshire, 90 and 91% turnouts, in Glasgow 75%. Now, whilst that seems fantastic for Glasgow, it's way behind what those other local authorities are doing. And if you look at the Brexit referendum, the pattern continues. So East Renfrewshire 76%, East Dunbartonshire 75%, Glasgow 56.3%. And what I'm driving at is extending from young people, voting becomes a habit and a culture and a pattern for individuals and for families. there are certain parts of the country where that happens a lot less, and there's geographical inequality. And I'm just wondering, in terms of the work that all of the partners around this table does, do you drill down on that geographical inequality, and do you target resources at the schools in those areas and the groups in those areas, and do you set any targets to address that inequality? So, for example, in 10 years' time, will we have failed, will you have failed if we haven't narrowed that inequality? I'm just wondering how we deal with that and how we tackle that.
As a registration officer, the first step, of course, is to make sure that everybody that can possibly be registered is registered. And of course, the more successful you are at registering, then arguably your turnout might actually go down in terms of how the figures look. But in terms of targeting resources, at the last year, when we were looking at education authorities and looking at schools that were signing up to the Electoral Commission campaign, EROs were feeding back information to the local schools as to whether their level of registration was high or whether it was low. So we could actually step on resources in areas where there wasn't the same sort of level of response to a campaign. So that was one area where resource allocation could be fine-tuned.
Can I just check, today then, the allocation of resources going forward, will your organisation and the partner organisations use recent voter turnout and voter registration patterns to target parts of the country that need more assistance? Will they get additional resources?
As a registration officer, I'm employed by Murray, Aberdeen Shire,
right, okay,
and Aberdeen City. So my resources are based in the northeast of Scotland. But what I will do is I will identify areas where my registration levels aren't as high as they should be, and will put either extra canvas material in there or contact if it's for example one or two schools that are not maybe signing up to the Electoral Commission campaign, then I will be aware of that, and I can speak to the education service, I can speak to the heads, I can speak to the principal teachers, and to try and redress that, and to try and ensure that across the Grampian area as a whole, we have as high a level of registration as possible.
Okay. Now, I would like other witnesses to comment, but I don't want to ask another question after this. I want my colleagues to come in, so I just want to make the final point that any additional resources, no harm to my colleagues that represent East Renfrewshire and Eastern Bartonshire. Of course, they're calling for resources in their areas, but if you're a youth worker or you're in a school or you're a stakeholder organisation in those areas and you're looking at 91% voting in the independence referendum, and you're in Glasgow or other parts of West of Scotland, and you're getting 75%, you say, what's been done to address the inequality? So I suppose that's the question, what's been done to address the inequalities?
And for most of us within the system, we have a geographical base as well. So just like Ian, I'm only interested and can only operate within my council area, which is where I would be looking for evidence of a particular school not being engaged or a particular area not having an active youth sector where there could be more effort made. There aren't resources to pull off the shelf. There's nothing that we can just add to what we have. So it's about allocating the resource we have as fairly as possible and trying to address any gaps. And maybe the national or the organisations that operate at a national level are better placed to answer. But what I could say is that there are relative priorities in each area and many, many factors that make a difference to whether people choose to register and then choose to vote. I mean, I would imagine that in Glasgow, well, in fact, I know that in Glasgow, there was a tremendous effort made to get as many people as possible to get over perhaps a natural cynicism about the issue of registration, where there were concerns, as I understand it, even still now, about registering makes you much more likely to be chased up for debts or whatever. So that's a legacy issue from way back in the poll tax days. But, that had to be overcome. Now, I know every time I go into a Glasgow City Council building, I will see a sign somewhere, normally next to the lift, which says, don't be worried about registration. It's not about chasing you. They address that head on. And I thought that was fantastic because it is actually going to deal with people's unspoken concerns about that. And it was a tremendous effort to get their figures up to 75%. That was not as good as in East Renfrewshire, but for Glasgow, these were really healthy figures. Keeping it at that level is the challenge, I suppose, because then we're back to, well, do people think the council election is as important as the independence referendum? Clearly not. But that's not just an issue for those areas, that's an issue across the country.
Okay. Andrew Neil, do you want to add?
From a resources point of view, a lot of what we do is for all voters. The national TV campaign, the household leaflet, all that sort of stuff, everyone gets it. We can, to a degree, target resources to certain sectors. So in terms of radio adverts, we can advertise on channels which are listened to, for say, by BME groups, by young people more. So you can do that, but the way we try and target resources is we provide resources to others who would then use them. So we work through the partnership programme to do that, rather than doing it ourselves.
Okay, Alan Armstrong?
Yeah, and just to finish off, to reinforce, I think that connectivity across the national organisations there, then that sharing of information is important, just about where registration is picking up well, where it's not, and certainly chief executives would do that on a geographical basis. Education Scotland can also do that with the connections we have with local authorities. So I think that drive to encourage everybody to pick up that registered voting is strong across the national partners.
Okay, that's really... Mary, do you want to add anything?
Just to say, I mean, you know, we don't just write to the head teachers about this. I mean, I did speak to CLD about it in my area, and I did speak to social work about it, because the children and family social work teams have most contact, for example, with looked after children, and that they prioritised that and made it the focus of a couple of sessions that they had with looked after children. And I was really grateful for that, because there are lots of issues that they would want to be focusing on, and I thought it was great that at least a couple of sessions were very specifically about trying to encourage those young people to get into the habit of registering to vote and voting.
That's really helpful. We'll move on from that. Thank you to my colleagues for their patience. Let's explore that line of questioning. Elaine Smith.
Thank you, Convener. Yeah, my colleagues have actually explored a number of the issues I was keen to explore, so I think you've addressed those, particularly Mr O'Neill letting us know that you do engage with Girls Brigade, Boys Brigade, Scouts, Guides, etc., because I think that's important to get outside the sort of formal school setting as well as to be in there. It was something I want to pick up specifically something Mary Pitt-Keithley touched on, and it was about national insurance numbers for young people. When the national insurance numbers are issued, is there any way of issuing voter registration papers, or can that be done? Is it done?
I wouldn't know, but I don't think so, based on my own experience of a youngster receiving their national insurance number. I think they only get that from whoever it is in government who issues national insurance numbers.
I think it's the DWP. Yes. That issue national insurance numbers, and they're issued at age, I think, 15 3/4 or thereabouts. And so this is a UK government responsibility, as far as I understand it. And the position is that we're working with the government digital service. When I say we, I mean electoral registration officers across not only Scotland but the rest of GB, to ensure that the government digital service that hosts the registration website is properly signposted, and we're looking at that sort of now messaging going out on national documentation across GB as a whole, because Northern Ireland is dealt with slightly separately. So that sort of line is being developed. I can't say when and how it'll be delivered, but that sort of line is definitely being developed. Yes.
It just seemed to me that young people are quite interested in getting their national insurance numbers at that stage, so it may have been something. Can I suppose, listening to all of the evidence we've had previously and the evidence today, the sort of crux of the matter seems to be that people won't vote if they don't understand why it's important to them and how it affects their lives. How do you all feel about different ways of voting, electronic voting? How do you feel about compulsory voting?
I think electronic voting will be inevitable at some stage, but there are so many issues around integrity and security that those need to be ironed out before everybody, including the older generation, perhaps would be confident with that. But undoubtedly younger people are so much more used to doing everything electronically and find it quite difficult to understand why they can vote for so many things X Factor, whatever, but they can't vote for their local councillor using their smartphone. So there will be increasing pressure from people who, you know, just don't see what the problem is. So the challenge for all of us, and I know the Electoral Commission is very heavily involved in discussing this with the Speakers Committee in the UK Parliament and with yourselves, the challenge is about how people can become comfortable with that as a way of voting for elected representatives in a way that the you know there's no concerns about integrity, no concerns about security. Now, you know, what happens around the world influences how we think about these sorts of things. So current challenges about hacking of voting systems and counting systems do give us all some concern, I think.
I think we'd also know that there are different ways of voting at the moment, as well as turning up at a polling station. People can vote by post, or they can appoint a proxy to vote on their behalf. And there's lessons to learn from that, I think, about the accessibility that brings, but also the integrity challenges that go along with it.
On that, could I just raise a specific point, convener, rather than raising it later?
Yes, Andy and I wanted to respond on some of that, and then we'll take your specific point if that's
To your earlier question, Mrs. Smith. I mean, obviously, we've looked at various ways of voting over the years. The Commission has always kind of supported a suite of mechanisms whereby you can vote to reflect modern society and people's lives and making it easier. And as Chris said, yeah, postal voting is very popular. 18% of people in Scotland are now registered to vote. Proxy voting less so. We are currently going through a strategic review as the Commission itself, and one of the things we're beginning to look at is if you did look at e-voting at some point in the future, what would you need to put in place to do that? And I think that will be discussed and go on in the future. But there's also other things which you could look at. For instance, early voting. We've just went through a kind of a presidential election in the United States. 35 states in America vote early. In several places there are polling stations open for weeks on end, some just a few days before. So there are things which you have to look at in the long term, and things you could actually do quite quickly, which the committee could look at.
Milton, I think, wanted to add something.
Yes, it's a very quick point, and it was picking up the last part of your question, which was about compulsory voting, and that would, of course, be a sea change in the relationship between citizen and state. But as a registration officer, I would see that might have a negative impact on my relationship. We're trying to make sure that we maximise registration. We might find there's a larger group of the citizenship who do not want to engage to avoid potential fines or whatever against them.
Thanks. Thank you very much, convener. I mean, that's interesting, and I think it is a debate we should be opening up and having and listening to your views on. I wanted to specifically ask about proxy voting, because probably it's less popular or necessary, given that we now have postal voting that people can apply for if they wish, rather than having specific reasons. But it still does matter to some people, and I think particularly perhaps to the group that Alexander Stewart mentioned at the beginning of older people who think it's a duty to vote and like to go and cast their vote at the polling station. And for those people, if they are taken ill and have to get an emergency proxy vote, and maybe this is something for Mr O'Neill's review as well, I think that I've had examples of where doctors, for example, are loath to sign papers, which means people are being disenfranchised, or they're charging at, for example, like the charge for a passport, to give the information for people to be able to get an emergency proxy vote because they've been taken ill. And I just think that's something that needs addressed, because it's quite serious if that's the case, then people are being disenfranchised because of a GP, for example, not wishing to sign a form or looking for payment to sign it.
Well, Ian Milton, you go first. I'll take you in later, Mr O'Neill.
I can pick up the bits that I miss out. I mean, you're quite correct. Proxy voting isn't as popular. I mean, postal voting on demand started in 2000. Since I became an ERO in 2009, the number of postal voters in Grampian has risen from 45,000 to 92,000 against an electorate of 442,000. It's just over 20%. Proxy voting, standing list proxy voters in Grampian is currently under 1,000. so it's less than 1%. So proxy voting isn't as popular. And one of the reasons, I suppose, is that you lose the secrecy element of the ballot, in that you have to advise your proxy how they wish to vote on your behalf. In relation to elderly people, or people who are maybe not necessarily elderly, but just can't get to the polling station and find that happens in an emergency situation. It happens after the 6th day before the election, so they've missed the opportunity to apply for postal vote, they've missed the opportunity to apply for a normal proxy vote, and they now have to get a supported proxy vote, an emergency proxy, and that has to be attested by, as you say, a health professional. It doesn't have to be a GP. There's a whole list of people who can attest an application, and it can also include a care manager. So if somebody is admitted at short notice to a care home, and because of some disability that means that they can't go to the polling station, then the care home manager is qualified to actually support the application. As for the charging, I can't speak about that, but as a registration officer, I can say that has not been raised with me by proxy voters or people wishing to vote by proxy with me in any election that I've been involved in.
Okay, Andy O'Neill, do you want to add to that?
Charging point. This has come up periodically. Our understanding is the contracts for GPs and surgeries and doctors employed through health boards don't allow them to charge for signing emergency proxies. So if anyone is, they shouldn't be. But it's certainly in the contract that in terms of conditions of service that they can't do that.
I just wondered then, Convener, if perhaps more information around that issue and to care managers, etc. Do the people that can sign know they can sign, and do they know they shouldn't be charging for it? I think it's an important point. It may not affect a lot of people, but for those it does affect, it's important to them.
Ian Wilson, yes.
If I may just pick up a point on that, the Care Inspectorate have included in a performance regime for care management of care establishments, following discussions with registration officers and other stakeholders, the requirement to support registration and participation is included in performance standards for care managers. The other thing that I would say is that I think particularly elderly people may find themselves in a situation where they don't have a proxy who stays nearby. Their family have maybe moved to another part of Scotland or elsewhere in Britain or even overseas. And one thing that we're trying to promote is the fact that you can appoint a proxy, a family member, and that proxy can actually vote by post. That isn't in an emergency situation, that is in an established situation where somebody is unable to go to the polling station.
Okay. Andy Whiteman?
Yeah. You can take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And one of our concerns, obviously, is turnout, and we are aware that you're responsible for primarily awareness and registration, etc. So on the question of registration, I mean, at any one point in time, there are X number of people who are eligible to be on the electoral roll. Do you have any sense, and you have Y number who actually are, do you have any sense of whether the total potential electorate is the proportion of the total eligible electorate that's registered is rising or not, and is staying on the electoral roll longer?
The electorate, certainly, if I speak for Grampian, the electorate in Grampian is rising year on year. But that could be just movement of people. There's no acid test as to, on a particular date, how many people are resident in Grampian and entitled to be registered, because not everybody is entitled to be registered, against what the register stands. The most complete sort of audit is actually the canvass that we do in the autumn of each year. And that is used to then inform National Records to produce population estimates that are then compared back to registers. So it's a bit of a circular route. But I can say, for example, that we take information from the 3 local authorities that I work with for council taxpayer information. And if we check that against the register, and if we find that we don't have a particular council taxpayer as registered to vote, then we will approach that council taxpayer and write out to them. And currently we're writing out we've identified currently in our system about 15,000 potential electors. And that's part of the churn of the system. There will always be that sort of number of people who we're writing out and encouraging to register to vote, particularly at the end of a household canvass, which has been a refresh of the householder occupancy information on our system, but not necessarily household registered.
Neil, do you want to add to that?
I think in general the electorate number in Scotland is rising. The figures I've got from 2010, we had about 3.8 million on the register, and we've currently got, well, at the Scottish Parliament election we had 4.1 million. We had a high point of 4.2 at the Scottish independence referendum. As to who's not on the register at any one time, it's very difficult to come up with an accurate, today we have that on the register. In fact, it's impossible to do that. We think it varies around about 8 to 15% in Scotland throughout the year, and it will depend on who's moved house, who's died and such like. And people, when they tend to move house, even with online registration, will tend to wait till the canvass period to go back on. So we used to talk about our kind of 1% derogation of the register every month. So it's quite difficult, but if you as a guesstimate, you kind of say maximum 18, 15%, something like that, not on the register.
In terms of electoral registration, you see it as your obligation to get 100% if you can?
Yes, we're obliged to identify potential electors, and we're obliged to engage with them. So, you know, that's what we do. Whether they engage with us, of course, is the moot point.
Okay, and on the question of turnout, I mean, I realise this is really, strictly speaking, not your responsibilities, but do any of you have any observations, having been engaged with the job of electoral administration, on why we have a historic low now for local elections since 1974 of 39.8%?
Academic research would suggest that it is about the extent to which voters think their vote matters. So thinks that the institution they're voting for matters, thinks that their vote for that institution will matter and will make a difference, or thinks that perhaps, you know, it's all pretty pointless because, for example, I think some of the research showed that if local authorities had no powers to raise council tax, for example, then what was the point of voting for them? Now, I don't know exactly what impact that would have on turnout, but there would seem to be some suggestion that there has been some impact. Now, we'll see if, you know, having those powers restored, will that make a difference to turnout in May of this year? Well, we'll have to wait and see. But there are so many factors that apply. I mean, you know, as a returning officer, I'm always incredibly aware of how much the weather can make a difference on the day. You know, if it's absolutely chucking it down or it's a horribly cold day, particularly for by-elections, we see that, you know, that can have a huge impact just on the turnout for the 80% that aren't entitled to, or haven't chosen to vote by post. So there's all sorts of things, and you know, the responsibility that prospective candidates have to engage with the electorate. You know, the number of times I hear people saying, and it's very anecdotal now, but the number of times I hear people saying, maybe you're the same, I never even got a leaflet this time round, so why should I bother? You know, so there's a huge, there's a really interesting research to be done, I'm sure, about why people decide on the day not to bother voting, and why, in converse, they do go out and vote.
Question of
anyone else has got views on voter turnout and the pattern in recent years?
He's right. I think there's huge numbers of reasons why people don't engage, one of which is, does it matter? Obviously, in the independence referendum, everyone felt it did. And some people don't think it does in local government elections. Tight elections always create higher turnout, as you probably know, because you're all politicians. So there are a number of places throughout Scotland which are going to be very hotly contested, so hopefully that will help. I think from the Commission's point of view, I think also there is a barrier to lack of knowledge of what happens in the polling place, literally the process of voting, that can stop people voting. And particularly with STV, how to vote is very important, and we're spending a lot of time ensuring that people understand how to rank their choices. If you look at the academic studies, back in ERS did some studies in 2007, 20% of the electorate only expressed a single preference. That went down to 13% in 2010. 2012 from a study which John Curtis did. Now, obviously, we also see, because we're in the count centres, and you yourselves as well, a lot of single X's on ballot papers. That is presumably people not understanding that you use numbers and you can rank more than one preference. So that's why we think in the coming months how to vote is important, because if you understand how to vote and how to vote with confidence, that's a barrier which will is gone, and that might engage you with the system and you might vote.
Andy Whiteman. Okay, Graham Simpson.
It kind of follows on from that. We've taken evidence, and Mary Pickhathley, you touched on this, that if people feel there's little point in voting in council elections, they won't vote. But you, Mary, know very well how important councils are and the range of jobs that they do. Is there any sort of general education going out to voters, or not just young people, but voters in general, about the importance of councils and why it's important to vote in those elections?
I mean, I can point to the work that COSLA is doing just to raise awareness of what councils do and the importance of councils and their place in the governance of Scotland. And I think some of that work is really very impressive, and hopefully will bear fruit. And individual councils will engage with the local media about what it is, you know, they do and what the issues are and why some of these issues are, you know, very, very important to individuals and to communities. So it's a combination of effort of individual councils and what COSLA might do, and what, in fact, you know, media itself chooses to do to highlight some of these issues that would encourage people to see these elections as important.
So the electoral community in Scotland comes together several times a year to plan out activities. We had a seminar in Glasgow last week. Returning officers, electoral registration officers, all in one room there, looking at a lot of issues around the delivery of elections this year. And we had a very helpful presentation from the Electoral Commission on the public awareness activity that they're undertaking, that we all work in partnership with. And one of the things we took away from that back to our own councils was something that the Commission is planning to lead on, about the On Your Doorstep campaign, about the role of councils, so that people understand the role that councils play in their lives, and to try and build on that to develop that appreciation as much as anything.
And we shared with everybody a link to the work that the Improvement Service and COSLA have done jointly to provide online materials. Some of this is targeted at helping with the induction of new councillors after the election, but it's also very important, I think, that we use as much of that as possible to just broaden public awareness of what you know, and maybe even encourage people to stand as a local councillor as well. So, you know, there's quite a lot of material out there. We just need to make sure we use it.
Time for a quick question. It's quite a technical question, this. I think, Ian Milton, you mentioned that you cross-check voter registrations with council tax records. The question is this: is it technically possible for somebody to be registered in two places at the same time? For example, so maybe a student who might have an address with their parents and they've moved away, they've gone to a different council area, or somebody could pay council tax in two council areas. So is it technically possible? It might not be legal, but can it be done?
Yes, it's not only possible, but it is legal as well, depending on the circumstances. You mentioned students in particular, and they are one of a fairly unique group of citizenship who are legally entitled if they are still resident at their, let's call it their family home, when they're not at their term time address, which might be a hall of residence or something. They are entitled to be registered in both locations, but they're only entitled to vote in any one election once. It's interesting, though, because student registration has been an issue that's cropped up with the introduction of individual electoral registration. And there's been a perception that student registration, or there's a lot of students who haven't registered to vote. It's correct that a lot of students haven't registered to vote now it's an individual responsibility of them to do so at their term time address. But when you speak to the students, if you visit universities and colleges like I've done, and speak to them and ask them why aren't they registered, because we can check on, we take in a secure laptop and check whether they are registered. And they say, I don't want to register at my term time address. I'm registered at home, and that's where I intend to vote, either by postal or proxy, or in fact just by attending. And it seems to me that students in particular, a large number of them, I'm not saying a majority, but a large number of them prefer to vote at not at their term time address, their home address. But so there are occasions when you can have two registrations, but your registration depends on residence. You have to be resident. Now, technically speaking, if you are resident in two locations, then there is a potential for you to be able to be registered in two locations.
Very interesting. I didn't realise that. So you could have two voting papers in two different areas. What checks are being done to make sure you don't use them both?
It's the voter's responsibility to not use more than one vote, to not vote more than once.
But what checks are done? Are there any checks in the system?
If we got evidence of somebody having voted twice, we would pass that on to the police.
Yes. This seems to have inspired a supplementary from MSPs. Ruth Maguire.
I suppose the convener, the question is, obviously you're marking the registers in the different places, but unless somebody reported that, there would be no way of knowing. Is that what you're saying?
I wouldn't know if the Ruth Maguire that was on my register was the same Ruth Maguire that was on the register in Grampian, for example.
Just to make sure.
Definitely. I get back.
Okay, are we leaving that line of question hanging, or do you want to follow up on any of it? Ruth Maguire, yes. Okay.
Would there be any way of checking, or is it a very, and I think I probably know the answer to this, is it a very obviously it's all done manually, so it's quite a, how would there be a way of checking?
Marked registers which are available to view after the event, so if people know you live in two places and you have two votes. I have to say it would depend on which election you were voting in. In two council elections you could vote in both. In the Scottish Parliament election you couldn't. You'd only have to vote once, and I know of at least one instance where that happens. I don't know if Ian, you want to talk about when people move from one area to another, there is a conversation between colleague EROs. So there are checks, which I don't think Ian would want to go into too much, to ensure that integrity issues don't arise. I think you have to say as well, there's very little evidence of electoral fraud taking place in Scotland, and where it does, it is literally individual instances. There is no there's no cases of organised electoral fraud which have taken place in Scotland in the recent past.
Yes, I would just say that the law in Scotland is substantive residence. So you really have to be substantively resident in two locations, which doesn't happen very often apart from as students. And when people apply to register to vote, they're required to give their former address. And what happens then is that the ERO who has a notice that somebody has applied to register in their area will advise the ERO of the former area that they have applied and they should be removed from their register. So it's quite straightforward. It can take each register is updated on a monthly basis during the outside the canvass period. So there can be a lag of a month, but we certainly make sure that we're advised of any registrations that have happened with people moving in and out of area. And there is an awful lot of churn in registers. As I said, it's a very dynamic situation these days.
Do any of our MSP colleagues who have explored this wish to add anything further at this point? There's a couple of brief supplementaries before we close the evidence session. The first one I'm indulging is from myself. I wanted to mention marked up registers. It was back to my initial line of questioning about targeting. We know which households vote, which households don't vote. Politicians frequently use a marked up register. For those listening that don't know the marked up register, is you can identify which households have voted in the last 5, 6 elections and which households have never voted. And politicians, unfortunately, most of them will make a judgment call that the ones that are habitual non-voters probably won't vote in the following election, and they may be less likely to get a knock at their door from a political party, because even when they tell you they're likely to vote for you, they probably won't vote. And that's the science of politics, unfortunately. But the point I would make is we know which households habitually don't vote, and that's their right, of course. But if we wanted to target the households in a positive, constructive, motivational way, because when we chat their door, we just want their vote, whereas you would just want them to vote, irrespective of who they cast their vote for. Is that marked up registered information ever used to target and encourage those households? We get so much information out there, I'm just not sure we're actually using it to increase voter turnout. Does that happen?
I think it would be a question of resources, convener. I wouldn't have the resources. I mean, I draw people in from across the council to work on the election, but as soon as the election is over, they go back to the day job. I wouldn't have the resources to carry out any sort of scientific exercise of trying to identify that. I haven't previously done that, no.
I mean, sorry, apologies on you.
I think there's also somewhat of a suspicion around the voter in general. I think people I talk to are quite wary about the existence of a marked register in any case. The fact that someone can follow up on whether they voted or not is something that people feel almost infringes the secrecy of the ballot. Not only how they voted, but the fact that they voted, people don't want anyone to know.
People expect the marked register to be kept very confidential and only used for the purposes that it's there for, which is really to check that there hasn't been any fraud.
But there is a transparency issue there, and everyone should know that everyone in Scotland can work out whether someone else voted or not. It's all public information. That's important.
Wary
that people
about
know
it,
that.
and they think that the fact that they voted is somehow can lead to knowing how they voted. And we got an awful lot of feedback about that after the referendum, that people were nervous about the fact that people were being told, we know you voted or we know you didn't vote, led them to think that actually officials and politicians also knew how they voted, which is not at all the case. But there were really deeply held suspicions about that, and it's something that I think we'd be very wary about. So I would find it difficult to justify the resource to do that exercise, the trawl through those marked registers, and then to somehow turn up at their door and say, "We know you haven't been voting. Why have you not been voting here?" You know, it would be potentially.
I'm not suggesting that would necessarily be how the information
no,
was
and
used. But we can all identify huge swathes of wards where even there's huge turnouts, but in one part of the ward the turnout could be 10-15%, another part it could be 75%. That information is held. It's how we target more effectively to motivate turnout in different areas.
Available from ballot box returns, from the ballot paper accounts, rather than necessarily trawling through the marked registers. So we would know that one part of one town had a very low turnout. And we could, we could do something about that, but it's.
And do you do something about that? Sorry.
Well, there's, I suppose, we might make more effort to use posters, use other ways of encouraging people to vote. But I mean, my experience in my area is that it's pretty even across the council area. There aren't huge discrepancies or disparities or divergence, but in other areas it might be more of an issue.
Really helpful. Andy, did you want to add something?
We don't use the marked register to inform our campaign, largely because the things we do in a national level. So, for instance, the national leaflet goes to all 2.5 million households. So, everyone gets one, irrespective of whether or not you've voted or not, and you're on the marked register. There is also, from over the years, we've perceived with colleagues who work at the local level, a concern that they may be perceived as being biased towards one particular party or another if they're concentrating on one area which is perceived as being X party's strong area as opposed to another. So there are, whilst I can see where you're coming from, there are inherent dangers for officials in going down that route.
That's very helpful. Final question of the session, Elaine Smith.
Thank you very much, convener. And I also think on the issue of marked register, it can sometimes be a Pandora's box for politicians, producing some nasty surprises and perhaps even fallings out. But I'll leave that there. I wondered if I could ask Andy O'Neill specifically. You mentioned, Mr O'Neill, the mistakes that can happen with the ballot papers, particularly I think when it's not an X in a box and it's a numerical numbering way of doing things. I wonder if the postal votes have less mistakes. Is that something that we know? And also whether or not that, if that's the case, would it indicate that maybe actual mock-up ballot boxes should be around the place, for example, in first stop shops, in schools themselves, etc.?
We wouldn't know because we don't look at the ballot papers that are sent in by postal voters. We simply don't look at them. They're kept face down all the time, and you don't do any examination of them at all. And so therefore they are only looked at when they come to be opened face up at the count, and then we wouldn't be able to tell which were postal votes and which weren't. So, but we can, we know roughly the percentage of voters who make an error in their postal vote identifier statement, and that has fallen dramatically to a very, very small percentage figure. And I suppose, if people can get that form right, you would anticipate that they wouldn't have a problem with the ballot paper, but we wouldn't be able to do any research on that because we're not able to look at the ballot papers.
I suppose the reason that, sorry, convener.
Andy O'Neill, and just to add to that,
Dad, I suppose from our perspective, it's about appropriate information to help you fill the ballot paper in when you've got it. So there is good pictorial information in the postal vote packs. There's a new rule in the local government rules this time round where there has to be an information poster in the booth, which we've been doing for a number of years, but now it's compulsory. So it's about having information at the time of when you're filling in the ballot paper, which in both instances we think exists.
And the pictorial information will change depending on what the election is. So we wouldn't use the same pictorial on the ballot paper, the single piece mailer that we use for postal ballots. It would be different for this election than it was for previous elections, because previously it would show somebody putting an X, and now it will show somebody using numbers.
Obviously, I appreciate why we wouldn't know, but it would be interesting to know whether or not, given more time to fill them out, people actually get it right. And then my final point that I made about a mock-up ballot box, part of the reason I ask that is there was an event at Summerley Heritage Park in Coatbridge recently where it was an educational event, different political parties just talking about the importance of voting, and there was actually a mock-up ballot box there for the young people to see what it was like, to see what a paper was actually like.
All for ballot boxes that have been borrowed by schools. I mean, when you come to make up your ballot boxes for the particular electoral event, a few weeks before, there's always a message goes round to say to schools, get the ballot boxes back, please, because they do make good use of them, and younger children in particular use them to vote for their school captain or their prefects or whatever. And we don't, we do it quite formally in schools so that they are used to a ballot box.
I suppose what I'm asking is wider than schools?
Yeah, I mean, I would be more than happy to accommodate any request, and have done over the years, for other organisations wanting to borrow ballot boxes. We lend them out all the time, yeah.
Okay. Very helpful. I know we've overrun our allocated time, but I wanted to allow the questions to reach a natural conclusion. This is just part of our attempts, not just for May's election this year, but I think some committee, it might not always be this committee, but one committee in this place has to keep a watching eye on voter turnout across all elections, and how we can work in partnership with what is very good work that each of the organisations we heard from today are doing. We do want to give added value to what you're doing and assist you where we can. So can I thank you for your evidence this morning, and no doubt we'll stay in touch with you, and we'll briefly suspend until we prepare for the next set of witnesses. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone, and we now continue with our evidence session, and we welcome Joe Fitzpatrick, Minister for Parliamentary Business, accompanied by Roddy Angus, Elections Policy Advisor, Scottish Government. Welcome to you both. Thank you for coming along this morning. And Minister, would you like to make an opening statement?
Thanks very much. Just very briefly, first of all, thanks for the opportunity to come along and take part in the session. As you know, governments don't tend to get directly involved in promoting registration or voting at elections, as that could easily be misinterpreted as electioneering. However, the government does have an important role in ensuring that the right environment and structures are in place to support the activities of others. And obviously I was able to listen to some of the last session where you heard from the folk at the front line, the Electoral Commission, Electoral Management Board, Education Scotland and electoral registration officers. Now, those organisations undertake a wide range of activities, as you've heard, to encourage voter registration, voter engagement and voter participation. Differences in voter engagement, registration and turnout are, I think, very important. It's crucial that we understand which groups are affected and in order that we can then direct support most effectively, which I obviously heard was part of the questioning that you had to the previous panel. As set out in the programme for government, I'll be launching a consultation on electoral reform later this year. Putting the voters first is one of the key principles of our approach to electoral reform. This inquiry is incredibly timely, as I'm sure that voter engagement will feature in that consultation, and I can assure the committee that we'll look very carefully at the evidence that you've received, at any recommendations you have and any conclusions you have when we're preparing that consultation. So thanks very much for the opportunity to be here today.
That's very helpful, Minister. Thank you. We'll move to our opening question from Elaine Smith, MSP.
Thanks very much, Convener, and thanks for joining us this morning, Minister. We appreciate that you've given us in writing as well that the government doesn't have any, well, the government has to be basically wary about its approach to this. But could I ask you generally if you have any views on how voter turnout in elections, particularly local elections, which tend to be rather lower, could be improved?
I think clearly we have a team of folk who you've heard from who are working in partnership to look at those issues. But I think there is a large responsibility on all of us as politicians to make the election relevant. You know, the biggest reason that people will give for not voting is because you're the same or it makes no difference if I vote. And I guess we all have taken off our MSP hats and putting on our party hats a particular role to make sure that people understand that is not the case. Whether it's a local election, the Scottish election, UK elections, referendum, it actually does matter what you vote, and it's our responsibility to try and make sure people understand those differences. And I think politicians in Scotland have started to look at new ways to engage with voters, which well, we can only hope helps improve turnout.
Thanks, Minister. I think we did discuss that with the last panel, that if people don't know why it matters to them, then you know that is the crux of it, that they're not particularly going to vote. But what about maybe things that you might have an influence on, like using different places to vote, shopping centres or e-voting, these, just trying to widen it out a bit?
So in terms of locations, obviously the returning officers decide which locations are appropriate, and we currently do have quite a good mixture of locations. It's, you know, I guess the local knowledge in terms of what's the best place that's going to make it most easy for people to vote. You know, I don't think it'd be right for us to say you should always do it in a shopping centre, or you should always do it in a school. I think there's been a drift away from schools where possible because of the impact of elections on the school day, and sometimes it's for some people it's not a place they would tend to go to, a school. So we do have, I think, more polling places which are, for instance, in community centres and in shopping centres, not supermarkets but shopping centres, where more people are able to just go in to vote on the way. I guess the challenge would be, would we ever be able to get to the point where people could select where they're voting? So rather than saying this is your polling place, saying, well, actually, you know, there's the opportunity to vote here, here or here. But clearly if we were going to go down that road, we'd need to have absolute confidence in whatever system it was that was making sure that people weren't voting more than once. It would almost certainly have to be some sort of electronic registration system and backed up, and we would need to be very confident that any changes on that side had the confidence of the electorates. I think that's one of the most important things, is that we can maintain the integrity of the vote. And I guess that brings me on to the other forms of voting. You know, we've seen a massive increase over the years in postal voting. And I think in the main, confidence around that has improved. There's still some people who just don't trust the idea of casting their vote and putting it in a post box, and will always want to go to the ballot station, and if they can't do that, to ask a proxy, because they have more confidence in that system. So I think it's very important we allow that. I'm open to the idea of us looking at other options, whether it's e-voting in terms of by email or electronic, but I think we'd be some way off having the confidence in a system. There is only, I think, one jurisdiction in the world which uses e-voting exclusively, which is Lithuania. And their system relies on an ID card, which we don't have. And so I think we need to make sure that any changes that we're making don't have unintended consequences going forward. But I think times move on, so we should be prepared to look at other things that might encourage and make it easier for people to vote.
And perhaps it would be possible to look at where e-voting does take place. I don't mean the X factor. I mean political parties voting, or trade unions voting. So there is, I suppose, here. We don't have to look abroad, but here there is evidence to be looked at of where that kind of voting takes place. It's not an election of government, a local government, but it's still important, and it still is governed by rules. So it might be worth looking at that to see whether there's any issues, what the issues are.
I totally agree, and we'd do that in partnership with our partners in terms of looking at other ways forward. I think Andy O'Neill mentioned that they were looking at some of these issues.
Thank you.
Kenny Gibson.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning, Minister. I know it's local government I'm wanting to focus on. I think you're absolutely right. It's how important an election is perceived that is of greatest significance in terms of deciding whether or not people will vote. But there are other factors, of course. And we saw in 2012 the first ever STV system without being linked to the Scottish Parliament election, and turnout was a record low. I'm just wondering if you consider how much choice has an impact on whether people vote. And I'll give you one example which I used at our own party conference. In the days of first past the post, Largs in my constituency would have 4 wards, and there'd be 4 SNP, 4 Conservative and 4 Labour candidates, possibly others as well. In the last STV election, because of the safety first approach of all political parties, i.e. put up the minimum number you think will get elected, the SNP put up 2, Labour put up 1 and the Conservatives put up 1. If an independent hadn't stood, there wouldn't even have been an election. And so people are faced with 4 people being elected out of 5 going forward. And I, as the individual who moved STV to our party policy some 20 years ago, have been deeply disappointed by the fact that the original idea of STV, competition between candidates of each party as well as between parties, has not been realised. And there's also, I feel, an attitude among some elected members that at the next election I only need to come 4th in that ward. So they're not really, some of them aren't exactly straining at the leash to represent constituents as effectively as they could, and that's by no means the case for all, but there are 1 or 2 I'm hoping that vetting and the voters will sort out. But there is a real issue about choice in elections, and is it time again in your review to look again at the electoral system? I realise it's only 106 days to the next one, but is this going to be looked at, the system itself?
Well, obviously, I'm a big supporter of STV. I think it's the right system, but we've now had STV in for 10 years, approximately, since it was first introduced. So I think it is appropriate that we look at how it's working in practice. There's been now 2 elections. You mentioned that the turnout for the 2012 election was down. and while it was down, maybe significantly compared to the elections which were combined, if you look at the last election where local elections were held on their own, it's maybe 5% down. So still 10%, but not quite as much as significant. So I'm not sure STV has been part of why that slight reduction. It's more about relevance. So we see that STV doesn't work perhaps for some of the more remote and island communities, and that's something that we're looking at addressing within the system as to how to make. Sorry, not STV doesn't work. It's the particular model of STV that was introduced back in 2006 that I think we need to look back at. Is there changes that were made? I was part of the COSLA body which was working with the Scottish Executive at the time to look at how STV was going to be introduced, and I know there was a large number of compromises which were introduced at that time. So what we have as a system is maybe not what you'd envisaged 20 years ago when you persuaded the SNP party conference to adopt STV as a preferred system. So I think it is appropriate that we look at that. I certainly wouldn't be minded to change the system as it says, but we can look at how it works in practice and where it's working for communities and for the voters.
I mean, obviously, the number of candidates that will be standing in this election in Scotland of all parties will be significantly lower than it was under first past the post. I mean, that's absolutely accepted. And it's hard to blood candidates now, for example, to get experience because there's a much higher chance of being elected simply because there are fewer people standing in for the reasons I said, the safety first attitude of all parties. But can I ask about one other thing which has been a bugbear of mine since the system came in, and it's about the randomisation of ballot papers. I don't understand why this has not been already implemented. I mean, I've got Alexander Stewart and Graham Simpson, Ruth Maguire here, who've all effectively, to some extent, would, if they were standing in an election, be less likely to get elected, all else being equal, than someone with my surname, simply because they're further down the ballot. And facts have shown that 92% of wards in which two or more people from the same party stand, the person lower down the alphabet are disadvantaged. Now, there are elaborate ways of trying to get around that, but surely it's time now, as the SNP does in its own internal elections, randomise surnames so that there is no advantage to Alistair Allen, for example, if he was to stand against Andy Whiteman. I should point out, Minister, before you answer that question, that Bob Doris is fairly open-minded about this. It just depends on who else might be standing. If possible, could you try and point your answer towards that might increase voter turnout, which is, of course, the focus of today's evidence session?
I think to answer Kenny's question, because it's quite difficult to answer that in the terms that you're asking me to. So, but I think it's a fair question. And it is something that we're looking at. But I guess we need to, because I agree that the problem exists, and while Mr. Gibson said all things being equal, even if things are not all equal, Mr. Allen might find it easier to get elected than Mr. Whiteman, even if Mr. Whiteman is more popular and more people have actively voted for Mr. Whiteman if they're in the same party, then as long as there's a percentage of people who have just voted for the party and not the person, then that could mean that someone who has less personal popularity could still get elected. So I think there is an issue. It's an issue which Mr. Doris makes the point that those folk further down the alphabet are more exercised about than those folk earlier in the alphabet. But I think it's an issue. It's not an issue we can resolve for this election, because clearly if we were to make any changes to the ballot paper, it would have to be tested in some way, and we'd have to make sure that again there was voter confidence in what comes out, because what's clear is that voters understand the A, B, C, D, E to W or Z.
Isn't it reflects in turnout, convener? And I mean, I know of issues because people have told me this individually, where certain female candidates decide whether or not to stand on their maiden name or their married name, depending on what it is in terms of the alphabet. The reason is because some people are dissuaded from actually standing
And again, it reduces voter choice because they say, well, my name's, you know, Wilson or something. I'd have to go against Mr. Brown in my own party. We're only putting one person up. We'll put two up. We've only got a chance of getting one elected, probably. Is it even worth my while putting my name in? So all these things, anything impacts on choice, both of the person that goes forward for selection and election and on the ballot it clearly has some impact, even if it's only marginal in turnout, but it certainly has an impact on the person and the quality of representative one has if one of the major criteria is your surname rather than your ability to represent a community.
Obviously, there's nothing in any of the regulations that stop parties doing selection processes that randomise, etc. So that's a matter for political parties and not for government. But as I say, it's certainly something that we are looking at, and you know, if we decide to go down that route in the future, I'm no doubt that it'll be something the committee will want to look at. If it's something that we think we can find a way forward, which, as I say, the most important thing is that the voters continue to have confidence in the system. We had an experiment in 2007 where ballot papers were changed for the elections. If you remember, we had the list and the constituency, the Scottish Parliament elections on the same ballot paper, and you know, so I think the lesson from that was we have to be very careful when we change things and make sure that we're testing any changes to make sure they're understood properly.
Just on Mr. Gibson's point, after I tried to get you back on the focus of this morning, you've raised a point, Mr. Gibson, in relation to the elections in May. Will the Scottish Government undertake to do an analysis of where there was more restricted choice and compare that turnout to where there was a more expansive choice? Obviously, you'd have to take into account social demographic issues and to kind of widen that out. Is that the kind of thing the Scottish Government would do?
That's the kind of thing that the Electoral Commission would do for the Scottish Government. So they would always do an analysis after the local election. So I can remember when I was sitting in your seat, speaking with Andy Neil sitting in this seat to talk about their analysis of the last local government elections.
And that, I mean, they are independent, of course, but what I'm trying to work out, that particular point I raise, would it be for the Electoral Commission to listen and say, we might want to look at that, we might not want to look at that, and they just do their analysis, or would government or this committee suggest that to them as part of their analysis?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few options around there. So whether, I mean, clearly it's work that they would normally take on, so it's perhaps best that we'll discuss that with them as to, I mean, I think the committee's been clear that it's a kind of analysis that you think should happen. So whether it's the Electoral Commission or SPICE or ourselves that pull it together, it sounds like it'd be something that'd be helpful for us to have. So, but again, you know, it might be that having the Electoral Commission behind such a document would give it the most veracity and the most confidence behind the findings.
That's really helpful. Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. We've heard earlier today that turnout can sometimes be affected by the relevance of the election to the public at large, how they feel it affects them. And we've had the STV system now for, as you say, 10 years. But there is still some confusion about ranking and putting crosses and the number of spoilt ballot papers that then occur at these elections because of the confusion that individuals still have, especially when they are having to choose more than one candidate on a ballot paper and choosing to put numbers or choosing to put crosses. And we've seen over the last 10 years that there is still that differentiation doesn't happen, or people get confused and rank 3 of them by putting 3 crosses rather than giving them 1, 2, and 3 in that process. But that is creating, as I say, in my experience, a large number of more spoilt papers being processed. So there is still an education to try and manage the public at large as to how they should process that. And we've heard today about how that is attempting to be looked at. But in reality, how can we process that if, as I say, we're still getting it wrong and it's still individuals are getting confused by the process?
Well, I think obviously 2007 was the first STV election, and there was quite a high level of spoilt ballots. In 2012, I think the number was drastically reduced. One of the reasons for that, I think, is because the Parliament took the decision, and those of us who were here in the Parliament at that time took the decision that we felt that the two elections should be separated for that reason. Now, clearly, I think at the time we all realised that that would have the knock-on effect that turnout would reduce for the local election, but at least people would the different systems and the different purposes of the election, because one of the challenges in 2007 when and actually 1999 as well, when there was two elections together, was that the local election gets swamped by the national election, and actually it doesn't do justice to our local government colleagues. So I think the separation was for good reasons. It gives us that additional challenge about how to drive up turnout. One of the means that voters effectively have an election almost every year, so there's the risk of voter fatigue as well. But I think that's worth it in terms of making sure that the local election gets its proper place and proper focus on the issues that are related to local elections. But I think we need to keep trying hard. I think one of the things that parties could do is to stop. Sometimes when, in particular in by-elections, you see it when there's only one candidate, and parties think, well, it's easier just to tell our voters to put an X, and just tell them to put a 1, and then if we all do that, then people will get more in the habit. But we certainly saw a reduction in the spoilt ballots in 2012, and I guess I hope that will, the work that the Commission are doing, that will happen again going forward.
Okay. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, Andy Whiteman.
Thank you, Convener. Thank you, Minister, for coming. I just want to ask you about the work that the Joint Law Commissions did on electoral law and published their interim report not earlier this year, in February last year, to create an argument for creating a single UK framework for electoral law, and then allow devolved administrations to adapt it as they saw fit, but to bring more coherence to the some 17 major statutes and 30 sets of regulations that currently exist. And at the time, Lord Pentland, who was Chair of the Law Commission, said that he looked forward to discussing this further with the Scottish Government. Have you had subsequent discussions since February, and what are your broad views on the Joint Law Commission's recommendations?
Yeah, and
of course, how that would impact on voter turnout, Minister.
Yes, clearly we want to make the system as straightforward for our EROs, returning officers and electorate as possible, and of course candidates in elections. And so streamlining in the face of it sounds good, but of course we're just about to receive these new powers, so you know, with those powers, my view is that we should, where possible, make sure procedures in Scotland are consistent, and you know, I'm absolutely happy to work with partners in other parts of the UK to see what is best practice, and you know, if best practice in Wales or England works for us as well as best practice, then I think we'll end up having one system. But I am keen to make sure those decisions are made in relation to the powers that we're about to get are made by this Parliament going forward. So
absolutely, and that is the intent of the Law Commission's review. But I was just asking specifically, have you had any discussions with the Scottish Government, with the Law Commission, Scottish Law Commission, about their recommendations?
I haven't personally had any discussions with the Law Commission.
There have been discussions at official level.
Okay, thanks. And in terms of your point that you made about creating harmony within Scotland with the new powers, presumably that's going to be the focus of the electoral bill you talked about earlier.
So,
I apologise for interrupting you, Minister.
I'll frame it in the way you want.
No, just hang on a second. This is for MSPs as much as it is for yourself, Minister. Okay. We've got council elections in May this year. Historically, council elections turnout are absolutely appalling, and the clock is ticking on that. Now, the work of this committee and the stakeholder organisations we had in the witness session before, and yourself, Minister, may make half a point or 1 point of a turnout difference. We've no idea if it'll make a blind bit of difference, but that is the purpose of this evidence session, to tease some of that out. So, with that in mind, Minister, could you respond to that question?
So, one of the things that we are trying to do is to say that, you know, if there's rules in relation to postal votes, for instance, or proxy votes, then there's no reason they should be different for the Scottish Parliament election than they are for local council elections. And so we would have that same systems, same rules, and I would hope that by having that commonality across elections, that would then make it more straightforward for voters to cast their vote, and hopefully that would help turnout as well. So I think we're trying to make a framework, certainly prior to, in the past it's been quite cluttered, and there's been different regulations and different rules, quite very technical stuff, which have been different for every different election and changing. And in the future, once the powers do come to the Scottish Parliament, I would hope that if we have an order in relation to postal votes, then that order would relate to all elections which this Parliament has responsibility for. So we don't need to do a local election in the Scottish Parliament election order in relation to postal or proxy votes, for instance. So that technical stuff, if we can streamline that, then hopefully that will make the elections more accessible and make a very small impact on turnout.
Yes, hopefully a big impact on turnout in the medium and long term. I take the convener's point that obviously we need to do what we can initially, but I raised the question because we don't want to be returning to this at every election, you know, a year before and just saying, what can we do?
I know you take my point. My point is that's the agenda item we're asking questions to the Minister on. That's the point I'm making.
Yep.
Okay? Any more questions? Okay, Graham Simpson.
Thanks, Minister. So you mentioned you're going to go out to consultation on electoral reform. Can you tell us what that consultation might include? And let's bear in mind what the convener's just said.
So I certainly expect turnout to be part of that, and we will, as I said in my opening remarks, look at not just any conclusions and recommendations that you come to as a committee, but the evidence that you took as well, because I think both sessions have been very helpful. I managed to watch most of the last session and I watched the session with the stakeholders, and I thought you got some really good evidence there, which we will consider in terms of the types of things that we could include in the consultation. We are speaking to the main stakeholders to try and make sure that we are including everything that should be in that consultation, whether that be in relation to wider matters or specifically about how we drive up turnout and registration.
Okay. All right. You obviously don't quite want to give the game away yet. I understand that. Can I ask what?
Sorry, to be clear, there is genuinely still a significant opportunity for us to feed more stuff into the consultation to make sure that the consultation covers the areas that it should do, and okay. The work that this committee has been doing will be able to be fed into that, because I know this inquiry and other inquiries you're doing, we will look at very closely.
So this committee could perhaps suggest areas that you might want to look at?
Well, we'll certainly look at the things, the inquiries that you've been carrying out and the work that you've carried out, the evidence sessions that you've taken on this evidence, and I think there's other areas as well, and we'll obviously look at that going forward.
Okay, that's fine. Can I ask, with the convener's permission, what your view is on voter ID? Voters having to produce ID when they go to vote.
I'd be very concerned about anything that we did that might be seen to be detrimental to certain sections of society being able to cast their vote. Now, I understand that the UK government will be carrying out a pilot at the English UK elections, and of course we'll look at that closely. I'm not sure there's huge evidence of significant voter fraud in Scotland, and I would be very concerned about doing anything which might, even unintentionally, make it more difficult for certain sections of society to cast their vote. It's always easy for folk who've got passports and driving licences to prove who they are, but I think I'd be concerned about putting an additional barrier in place. But clearly, the UK government are proposing to do pilots during the English local government elections this year.
No, I think it's 2 years' time.
2 years' time. 2 years' time. So I think it's appropriate that we look at that and see how that's actually worked. But I think we need to be very careful of unintended consequences.
Okay, fair enough.
Ruth McGuire.
Thank you. Good morning. Convener, I'm interested to hear the Minister's comments and reflections on the public awareness campaigns that we heard details of earlier. Also in our written evidence, which you may have seen, we got quite detailed feedback on what's happening in schools and colleges. So just to hear your comments on that, and if you think that any of these approaches could be extended to increase turnout in other hard-to-reach communities or sections of our society that aren't turning out to vote.
I think you certainly heard from the last panel the enthusiasm that there is by all the stakeholders to, first of all, drive up voter registration, to get registration to areas where the registration has been lower, and then to encourage turnout. I think we, as a government, didn't support the early introduction of the independent voter registration system. We felt that that was rushed, but nonetheless, I know our EROs across Scotland have worked really hard to take that on board and to drive up turnout. So I think we heard that the turnout at the Scottish Parliament elections was almost as high at the election as it was in the independence referendum, which was obviously the high water. I mean, and I don't know about other areas, but certainly in Dundee, people were queuing up in that referendum to register for the very first time. So you could see in that referendum there were people being engaged in the system, in the electoral system, that had never been there before. And at the Scottish Parliament election, the individual voter registration was almost that high by the time the election comes. So I think we're seeing a shift of the high water used to be in October, December, when the household register had been done. That was the highest the register would be, and then it would fall off as its accuracy through the year went down. And I think now it looks like the high water is at the election. So it's really important we make sure that the systems we have in place, particularly the online systems, are working properly to make sure people can use that. Some of the interesting things in terms of reaching the different areas, I know there's a lot of work with Youth Scotland and YouthLink to try and get to particularly young people who have, for whatever reason, not managed to engage at school, although the evidence we're hearing is that EROs are finding it easier to engage with young people who are still at school, because they're 16, 17, is a higher percentage still at school, so therefore that's an easier process than it was when they were trying to engage for the first time at 18 to 24. So I think we need to continue to look at all the options, but I think there's good examples from particularly the work around youth and the work that's going on with some of the other minorities to try and make sure that we are getting people registered and then making sure we understand the barriers to why they're not able to vote. So.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I maybe ask, Minister, at the last evidence session we heard from the Electoral Commission, we heard from Education Scotland, from the Electoral Management Board for Scotland, and from Ian Milton, who's an ERO and Chair of the Electoral Registration Committee of the Scottish Assessors Association. Do any of those groups have a statutory duty to increase turnout? And I'm not referring to make sure people can easily register to vote and that they understand the vote and that the process and the mechanics and the structures are all in place in an easily understandable way. Do any of them have a statutory duty to increase voter turnout?
Well, the EMB statutory duty is about making sure it's assisting local authorities to do all that work. So I guess they are for local elections, so they probably got the closest to that statutory duty, but clearly a lot of the functions are carried out by the Electoral Commission. There's no statutory duty. The EMB doesn't have any statutory duty in terms of other elections in Scotland, so they don't have a statutory role for Scottish Parliament elections, for instance. They still carry out that role, and I guess one of the things we need to look at is whether they should have that statutory role for other elections. they have a power to direct in local elections, which they don't have for Scottish Parliament elections. Now, as it turns out, that's generally okay, I think, because the ERO and returning officer community work pretty well across Scotland, but as it stands, there's no statutory duty for elections other than local elections.
Okay, and is that a statutory duty to increase turnout or a statutory duty in relation to the mechanics?
So it's about promoting elections rather than increasing turnout. But you can see that how the things are interlinked. So and if so the overall responsibility is I guess shared by the partners that you just had. I mean, I guess the organisation which does most in terms of promoting turnout is the Electoral Commission, I think, in terms of their advertising work. But they do that also in partnership with the Electoral Management Board.
Okay, that's helpful. I mean, I used figures in the last evidence session to illustrate a point. For example, in council elections, and I picked one of the wards in my own constituency that was a 27% turnout. Compared to one in a neighbouring constituency that was a 39% turnout, so that I feel like an inequality of turnout from two wards relatively close within each other. That's within Glasgow, but if you look at the wonderful turnouts at the independence referendum campaign, 90-91% in East Renfrewshire and East Bartonshire. Glasgow very high, but 75% or something like that in Glasgow, still way behind other local authority areas. Does any group, body or organisation have a responsibility to address those inequalities?
Well, I think we all have a responsibility, and that I think includes us as politicians.
Yes, Minister, absolutely.
To drive up that turnout.
Moral responsibility, ethical responsibility, but as a statutory body or public body or organisation out with politicians, where we all have our own self-interest in relation to it. Does any one body have a duty in relation to that?
I don't think there would be a specific duty there, but I think it's something that the challenge is that we need to fully understand why that is, and I think that's part of the challenge. But
a duty to increase turnout actually could have adverse consequences, because one of the ways to increase turnout would be to knock anybody off the register that didn't vote at the last election. It would increase your turnout, but it would mean less people are registered. As you increase the size of the register, unless you actually get more voters out to vote, turnout will fall.
I agree with all those comments, Mr. Angus. However, my concern, it's a genuine concern, is that yes, politicians have got these responsibilities. We see a disparity across the country. There's socio-economic reasons for much of that. I get all that as well. I'm just wondering whether I look at Education Scotland, or if I look at the Electoral Commission, or I look at the Electoral Management Board for Scotland, I want to know, separate from us politicians who want the votes to win the elections, who's setting targets and outcomes that we can then scrutinise to see how effective were they at doing those jobs, and who has that duty, and what consideration would you give to maybe putting a more, with respect to independence, of course, a more formal structure in place to scrutinising some of that work?
I think scrutiny is always possible, and I think your suggestion of there being some sort of analysis of the outcome of the next council elections is probably would be helpful to us understanding. I think there might be a challenge if we were to, our registration officers just want to get everybody on the register, and so to set, and they appear to be doing a really good job. A new system was brought in place at much faster speed than we or they had asked for. We'd asked for more time in terms of transition, particularly because of the particular election timetables in Scotland. We didn't get that, and I think they rose to the challenge, and we can see that we're getting more people registered. I guess it's difficult, as we had in the last evidence session, to know what is the actual number of folk who should be registered for different elections who are not yet registered. So we should be always trying to drive that up. you know, I think we always have to look at what work the Electoral Commission are doing in order to drive up turnout. And if there are ideas about how that can be done better, I'm sure the Electoral Commission would be keen to hear that. I'm not sure saying if you don't get a turnout of X, then that's somehow you failed is going to be helpful.
To be fair, Minister, I'm not sure that's what I said. These things are hugely challenging. Yeah. And what we're just having early discussions about what something going forward might look like. And the easiest thing in the world to do is to pick 20,000 reasons why something can't happen rather than look at how we can make something happen. Final question from myself would be, given the disparity of turnout, and we haven't mentioned the individual groups, I'm conscious of that, but given the disparity of turnout across Scotland, depending on each local area, would you expect the Electoral Commission or Education Scotland or electoral registration officers or Electoral Management Board for Scotland to target existing resources more at areas with poorer turnout to address such inequalities, or existing resources are obviously tight? Is there a case for additional resource specifically to target areas with poorer electoral registration or poorer voter turnout? Because if we're really serious at tackling this, I mean, I've sat on this committee, predecessor committee in 2007, we looked at the fallout from previous elections. We talk about it a lot. I'm just not sure how we actually map out what real achievement looks like.
So the Electoral Commission, in terms of the programme that they've got going forward to increase turnout and registration for the local elections, they are working with a number of partners, particularly where there are groups where we know that historically there are challenges. So they're working with the NUS, for instance. They're working with students, young people, homeless groups, and ethnic minorities and people with disabilities. So they're working with all those partner organisations to make sure we can get to places that maybe the mainstream media advertising or booklet through the door doesn't work. So it's about using the resources better to target the right people. The resource that the government has allocated to the Electoral Commission for this election in terms of these tasks is £1.6 million, just over £1.6 million. So it's quite a significant sum of money, and obviously they're looking at how they can use that best across the piece. But they, I know, are specifically looking at those areas where they are harder to reach and lower historic turnouts.
Yeah, I think we heard some of that earlier on. That's helpful, Minister. Elaine Smith.
Thanks very much, Convener. Can I just ask about the franchise, Minister? It always intrigued me that Jenny Lee, who was an MP when she was in her early 20s, but the franchise was 30, so she couldn't actually vote for herself. But it seems to be different in this election, so that it's been extended for this coming election to 16 and 17-year-olds, but they can't actually go forward as candidates, as I understand. I wonder if you, presumably you're going to be looking at the franchise from here on in. Would you be looking at that?
So obviously the decision to extend the vote to all elections which this Parliament has control over was taken in the last Parliament. So the franchise for voting is 16 for the Scottish Parliament election and local elections, and I think that is now universally agreed to be the correct. I think it's certainly something we should look at. Would the age of standing, should that be differentiated or not? I mean, it currently is. It'd be interesting to hear arguments as to whether it should be or shouldn't be. I've certainly heard the case put to me by young people for why they quite like the idea that they get to vote for a couple of years and then they get to stand. And I've also heard other young people who say, no, I have something that I think I can put to the electorate and I should be allowed to put that to, and it's up to the electorate then to say if you're too young or not, and to make the decision as to whether, irrespective of age, that person is the best candidate. So there are clearly arguments. So it's certainly something I think we have to consider. Whether it would be included in the consultation or the bill that we bring forward, I'm not at this stage certain. One of the things that we have to be careful of is the regulations in terms of the new powers coming to Scotland would require any changes to the franchise would require a supermajority. So you would take a bill which potentially is mainly dealing with issues, technical issues, tidying up, proving that the electoral system that doesn't require a supermajority, and adding something which would make the whole bill require a supermajority. And so that's something we have to consider, and the Parliament hasn't yet come to a view as to what the processes are around supermajority. So but I think it's a reasonable thing for us to consider.
Yeah, and I just wondered, in terms of the forthcoming election, that maybe even just talking about it at the moment would help to raise awareness, would help to focus on the importance of local elections and representation and what the councils do for people. I mean, alternatively, to get turnout, maybe we could start a rumour that only those that are voted on the match register will get their bins collected in future. Actually, it's a serious point. I mean, it's a serious point, Minister. I think maybe people aren't aware there is a match register. We had a bit of that discussion earlier as well.
I see Graham Simpson nodding his head when that suggestion was made, so I'm not sure what will be in the Conservative manifesto going forward in May. Do you want to follow up on any of that, Minister?
No, I think it's all good stuff for discussion, I think, is the main point.
Would other members like to come in for additional questions? Well, can I thank you for giving evidence, and just note that we are very interested in the forthcoming elections bill and what may or may not be in that. And it will, of course, as my colleagues did try to tease out today, go way beyond voter turnout. And I suspect we'll discuss in private reflections in the evidence sessions. I think there's maybe a feeling that one committee in the Scottish Parliament, irrespective of the elections issue or the tier of government the elections are at, should be focused and responsible for making sure that there is good management right across the board, and I'm sure this committee would like to follow through on that, irrespective of what elections we're talking about, given the consistency and learning from best practice from elsewhere. So we're focused in May this year, but it's an ongoing work of this committee to work with government and the stakeholders we heard from earlier, and we're keen to do that. So can I thank you again for giving evidence this morning, and we'll suspend briefly until we arrange to the next agenda item. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, welcome back, and we now move to agenda item 3. The committee will consider 3 negative instruments as listed on the agenda: SSIs 2016/402, 2016/411, and 2016/421. These instruments are laid under the negative procedure, which means that their provisions will come into force unless the Parliament votes on a motion to annul the instruments. I can inform the committee that no motion to annul has been laid for any of the instruments, and can invite members to make any comments they may have on the instruments before us. No one has indicated they want to make any comments in relation to that, so given that fact, can I invite members to agree that this committee does not wish to make any recommendations in relation to these instruments? Are we agreed? Okay, thank you for that. And with that, we do now move into private session as we move to agenda item 4. Thank you.